Great. All right. Well, again, thanks. Let's get rocking and rolling here. So, look, I'm going to talk a little bit about global health, kind of generally. I'll talk a little bit about kind of the Global Health Initiative and what we what we do here in terms of global health at Wabash, and actually, I'll save some of that stuff if there's time at the end. If anybody wants to hear more about kind of the initiative and what we're doing, I'll like I said, I'll pepper some of that in. But I always kind of have a couple of canned slides after the kind of the main event that if anybody's interested in that, please let me know. Just like we're off to a good start on this. So if you have a question or a comment or something like that, I'm really bad about the like if you try and raise your hand or something like that. So so please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and to just interrupt. Don't assume I'll see your hand or anything like that. So sorry about that, but that's just kind of the way it is. So to start, really broadly, I just want to say that and this is some of the things that the way that I kind of approach this with students right here at Wabash, right? So when we think about kind of what is global health, one of the things to say there is that global health is local and global health is global, right? And this is kind of an artificial divide. Really, is kind of reflects a little bit of the history of the field, as it were, in the sense that there kind of used to be this kind of historical divide between kind of what was going on local public health, your local health department, or maybe even at the state level or something like that. But then there was international health, right? It was kind of those people over there, right? And there was there was kind of this idea that there were kind of two worlds, right? And I think that it's important for us to kind of see that we're all in the same world, right? So that was an artificial divide, and so when I talk to students about yeah, we can go to Peru, go to South America, we can do international health, but Crawfordsville, as it turns out, is also on the globe, right? So to work down the street at the local health department is to do global health. Although so if I may interchange global health and global public health and so forth, but understand that from my perspective, that's a lot of the same thing, right? So I mean, you have in this picture a couple of, on the left hand side, these are guys who were sorting mosquitoes, doing West Nile surveillance down at the local health department here in Crawfordsville, just down the street from the college. There's lower left is a guy who's working in rural Appalachia who at a clinic down there as part of one of our summer internships. And then, on the international side, students who were part of my global health class, getting a real stretching, transformative experience. There's nothing I don't think is kind of quintessential liberal arts and getting guys immersed and in uncomfortable situations than this picture of Kevin McCarthy, who is explaining to a bunch of Peruvian women about women's reproductive health in Spanish. And so if there's nothing that will get a guy out of his comfort zone, then that, and I'm not sure what it is. So, but this is kind of a non-rhetorical thing. I'm going to throw this out to you just to kind of get the juices flowing and kind of hear from you. So don't hesitate to unmute your mic. And just kind of ask you, like, so what is global health? Like, what do you think, right? What are the main considerations? What ought to be part of those considerations? Go. And some of you are experts, like way more expert than I. So don't hesitate. I'm going to ask you tonight several questions that are mostly obvious. So don't assume everybody knows that. Just jump in. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Alan Hatfield. Can you hear me?
Yes, Mr. Hatfield, go ahead.
Thank you. Generally, global health is all things that affect the parameters of how we measure health in a population, longevity, successful birth rates, access to food, clean water, whether they have been vaccinated for things, whether they have any health system that can support them during those things. And as these cultures, they want to be more like the Western cultures. And so as they go forward, they get diabetes in larger numbers and other types of Western illnesses, and often are unprepared in health systems for things like that. For instance, across India, very few women undergo mammography to screen for breast cancer and other types of HPV infection vaccination, or even simple pap smear. So global health is a very wide topic and gets a lot worse when climate change and wars and other things displace populations, and basic systems of support disappear from countries. That's a tiny shot of global health.
That's just a tiny shot. I think we're done here, people. Thanks for coming. That was excellent, right? So, I mean, captured so much of that. I'm gonna kind of move. I'm gonna go to, I mean, in addition to Mr. Hatfield here, like, so what other people have said about this? I'm gonna
I'm actually a physician, but that's okay.
Dr. Hatfield, I'm sorry.
No problem.
So thank you for the correction. So this is a definition that, as a physician coming out of a big medical journal several years ago in the Lancet, right? And there was a group, there was an executive board, right, that got together and at this consortium of universities for global health. And the idea was to, because it was kind of embroiled in this whole issue of kind of public health, international health, and so forth. And what is the focus? And as Dr. Hatfield pointed out, I mean, right on the money in terms of a focus not on medicine, not on clinical per se, but rather on populations, right, on communities, on population health. What is global health? How do we get kind of this common definition that everybody can use? I'm not sure that we've gotten that common definition in the last 11 years since this was published, but just to draw your attention to a couple of things, right? A lot of which I've underlined. One is that global health is really pivots a lot more and more on this whole idea of equity, and trying to get health for everybody, and that's, of course, is going to highlights a lot of things in terms of the current political climate and so forth. I think one of the other things, kind of right down the middle of the plate for a place like Wabash and any liberal arts institution is the idea that this is it's a multi-disciplinary endeavor, right? It's an needs interdisciplinary collaboration. It synthesizes both that population size-based collaboration, population-based prevention, as well as kind of individual care. And these are questions, these are issues that go across, that cross boundaries, right? They're transnational. When we talk about kind of different health issues, different things that feed into different health outcomes, right? And as Dr. Hatfield pointed out, right, kind of even to the really big issues of things like climate and so forth, that those become more and more important. And so this was the thing that got published in the Lancet, right? And it was interesting because in that same kind of meeting, I was not at this meeting, but in that same CUGH meeting, there was an individual from a lower income country that stood up and said, what I think is global health is a concept fabricated by developed countries to explain what's just regular practice in developing nations, right? And it was actually a little bit of a comeuppance and a little bit of a statement towards, who are the people who get to make the decisions and publish in the top medical journals and kind of make the policy kind of calls for most of the people in the world. And this is not, my intention here is not to kind of like duke it out over that by any means, but it is an important kind of component to thing to think about. And I think one of the things I hope to kind of get us to be thinking about are just some assumptions and perceptions about kind of what global health is and what it does, right? So one of the other kind of definitions that I oftentimes raise to students is this one from Paul Farmer. lot of you know who Paul Farmer is, was a co-founder of Partners in Health. He's a Harvard professor in Harvard Med School at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, the teaching hospital for Harvard, and has done a few other things. You know, one of the things that Farmer had written a while back now is that global health remains a collection of problems rather than a discipline. And again, very big with Partners in Health, like the collection of problems that turn on the quest for equity. But I think that whole notion of that global health is a collection of problems, again, makes it incredibly attractive, and in a lot of ways was the thing that kind of drew me into this. My background is not in global public health. My background is in wormy kind of parasites and the ecology and transmission of critters that don't go into humans. And so it was really kind of like my teaching in parasitology and becoming a little bit less satisfied with teaching students about, you know, oh yeah, hundreds of thousands or millions of people get infected and millions of people die every year of this or that parasitic disease. You know, go do good things, go to med school, go do other things. And, you know, I became less satisfied with that. And that in conjunction with just other things kind of going on in my family's, you know, personal life was kind of really found this kind of marriage of that and kind of the social side that I think kind of is very attractive for a liberal arts school, and I mean every university, and certainly every liberal arts university ought to be embracing global public health as things in which to engage their students. So as we think about kind of global health challenges and health outcomes, and you take a look at some of the photos that are here, and this is from one of the field sites where I take students in Peru. This is on the southern edge of Lima, the capital city. You know, I would just pose this question to you that popped up in this photo, like what health problems do you see? Like what potential health problems do you see? Another mostly obvious but non-rhetorical question.
Sanitation.
Sanitation is a problem. There is really in this area, in this community, and you can see, I don't know if you can see, but this is a really large community. There's limited sanitation services. What else?
Standing water, zoonotic diseases.
Yeah, right. So you've got these barrels, right, that have water, and so certainly breeding grounds for insects and things like that. These are actually, you know, if you would see these, you know, different places along the way, there'll be water trucks that, you know, if you're down in the nice part of town, in the nice part of Lima, you would see these kind of watering vegetation in the middle of the highway and stuff like that. But you'll also see them kind of up in this area, and they're filling those up. And for some people who live in this community, that's their water source, right? So people will come down and they'll have a bucket. There's a lot of other people that have water that's piped into their house, or what you'll see are these kind of barrels, and there'll be basically a garden hose, you know, in there, and they're gravity feeding it down the hill. And that's the water source coming in. Now that might go into a faucet or whatever, and that's great. But clearly there's some potential problems there. Anything else? Other than there's a lot. But
you're gonna have fecal material going downhill into the town from the animals.
What flows downhill? Yeah, right. So thanks. Right. So these animals, I mean, you know, you see this, and part of the tough part about the question I'm posing to you is that you really don't know kind of the context of where this is. Maybe this is on a farm or something like that. And the reality is that this is in an area where, you know, just out of the frame behind that hog is basically where somebody lives, right? And so there's a very close proximity to waste issues, to potential kind of zoonotic disease, as was pointed out before. And in fact, this area has a really large problem with what's called cysticercosis, which is a tapeworm infection that goes through hogs and can it's a human parasite, but can go through hogs. And if you interject in the wrong part of the cycle, you have some serious problems. So the thing that I want to kind of point out is that this is one of the frameworks that I give to students, that when I think about, and again, coming out of kind of a background in parasitology, when I think about disease and health outcomes, This slide might be familiar to some people it's easy to kind of look at this and look at that vertical thing and like, this is a biological problem, right? If somebody in that community has a big, foot-long nematode that's living in their intestine, look, that's a biology problem, right? I mean, there's a parasite, there's a host, there's all kind of ecology and transmission dynamics that go into that. There's all kind of environmental conditions that require, that require the soil to be at the right moisture and temperature to be able to have eggs survive in that environment. And there's all kinds of things, right, in terms of kind of within that person, there's all kind of immune dynamics and so forth. But at the population level, and you look at kind of, is there a parasite problem in that? It's not just a biology problem, right? It's a problem of economics, right? There are people who live in that area who don't want to live in that area, but it's the only place where they could go, right? There's an issue there in terms of kind of, there's lots of legal things in terms of a lot of the people who live in this area, like actually don't own the land on which their home sits. And so, they can go to the government, they can go to the local municipality and say, hey, like we need water services, we need sanitation services. And the government says, I'm sorry, but who are you? Right. And there's a historical legacy to that as well. And clearly, there's lots of issues in terms of kind of education of the population with regards to their education about various health outcomes in terms of infectious disease or non-infectious disease, and as well as kind of social and cultural practices that play into lots of health outcomes, again, not necessarily even parasitic ones. So, certainly access is one thing. And I think that one of the things is that we can look at these kind of pictures and we can talk about these kind of infections and think that that's just like really far out there. We get this picture of international health. And I want to kind of give you a context to this, and that is that this is a satellite photo of this area, and on the right-hand side, you can see this little kind of rectangle or whatever, right, that is on the right-hand side. That's kind of, if you were standing on that hill where those water barrels were and looking out over that little kind of valley there, that main street that's down in the middle of that valley. And so, you'd be standing right by a couple of those houses. And the thing that I understand is, like, you can look over here on the left, and that same size, I kind of cut and paste, and same size rectangle that's over here where you might be able to notice a bunch of swimming pools and parks and green space. I mean, that dotted line is maybe a third of a mile, right, as the crow flies. So this is not far. Now, it is interesting that I'm highlighting here, there is literally a wall that exists between these communities, and I'm going to hazard to say that it's the people on the left side of this diagram that built that wall. And you need to understand that there's other things that go into the health outcomes for people who live, for example, right here, who used to be able to work in people's homes as maids or whatever. And the fact that this wall is there means that they now have to take buses, and that bus doesn't go right along the edge of this wall, right? And so now it's hours on public transportation, for example, to get what used to take them 15 minutes maybe. And so so I'm showing you this to kind of give you a little bit of context, but I want to, again, that raises our assumptions and perspectives, right? Because this is also not that far away from that previous picture, right? So these photos on the left, for example, are this lighthouse and these high-rise hotels that overlook the Pacific Ocean and are near some of the restaurants with some of the best cuisine in the world, right? Lima in Peru is like one of the gastronomical capitals of the world and has produced some of the best chefs in the world. That area is about 5 miles or so from that community that I just showed you in those pictures. And so, that's, I think, it challenges our assumptions, it challenges our perspectives on kind of like what these communities mean. It's not, them and us, right? It's a very kind of close proximity kind of thing, and that's going to come up again. So, I build this talk as talking about neglected tropical disease, and so I want to kind of do a little bit of kind of talking about, I mean, you can't do this kind of talk and not talk about a little bit of worms. And so, so what are neglected tropical diseases? And you may have seen this guy, Peter Hotez, on the news a lot. He's on the news. He's getting interviewed all over the place. He's in Houston. He's a dean of the first kind of American School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene down at Baylor. Hotez has been a champion of kind of getting people to understand about neglected tropical disease. And the way he would describe this is, these are the most important diseases you've never heard of. Let's take a look at a couple of these. And we're going to look specifically at one or two, but not that many. And this is a dizzying list, right? But so there's a couple of different categories of these. There's a bunch of these that are worm infections, like, helminths. That's kind of the cool party word for worm in this context. And some of those are transmitted through the soil, right? Just like those infections we were talking about, you get contamination into the soil and you either ingest that or larvae penetrate into you from the soil. And so in most of a good half of these, ascariasis, hookworm, trichuriasis, right? Those are all nematode infections. Those are those soil transmitted helminths. Several other of these are vectored or use intermediate hosts. So for example, lymphatic filariasis or onchocerciasis, drunculiasis, those are all nematode infections that use some kind of intermediate host, whether it's mosquito vectored or whether it's some other intermediate host that you have to ingest, for example, in terms of guinea worm. Some of these we've made incredible gains, right, in terms of the numbers of infection. And so guinea worm is an incredible success story, largely driven by former President Jimmy Carter through the Carter Foundation, but the Carter Center. Some of these others, schistosomes, schistosomiasis, foodborne trematode infections, those are all in a group that are parasitic flatworms that are called trematodes or flukes. And then you get the tapeworms that cause things like cysticercosis and neurocysticercosis that gets into your brain if you happen to accidentally ingest some eggs that were coming out of a tapeworm infection, and humans can get something that's called echinococcosis. If you have worms, you've got some ones that are kind of single-celled critters that are protozoans that typically have insect vectors. So things that are like leishmaniasis. This is one of the reasons that soldiers in the US who have gone and fought in the Middle East, for example, oftentimes they come back and can't donate blood because of the potential for having leishmaniasis infection. Chagas disease is one of the leading causes of heart failure in Central and South America because of the way that single-celled parasite gets in and causes the cardiac tissue to get really flabby. And so what you have are 30-year-old men who are out doing work and keeling over because of heart attack. And you may have heard of African sleeping sickness, for example, which is a close kind of the African counterpart. And then there's bacterial infections. One of the world's kind of most preventable kind of causes of blindness, trachoma is bacterial infection. Some of these others that you may have heard of in terms of leprosy, right? Now Hansen's disease, and then there's viral infections. Mycetoma is a largely fungal or bacterial infection, but dengue, I mean, these are ones that you've heard of, rabies, Zika, Ebola. And so some of these are really well known, obviously. And so it does beg the question a little bit of why are they neglected? And there's two kind of components of that. There's one component of that is like, well, they're neglected because they in fact infect mostly neglected people. And so one of the things you'll hear again is that neglected tropical diseases are diseases of poverty, that these are diseases of the poor and excluded. I think, and one of the other components of this, and we'll hit some highlights of that stuff, but one of the other components of this is that they're neglected from the standpoint of largely of funding, right? And this is oftentimes put in the context of the big three being malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS. Right. And in fact, if you hear, Peter Hotez kind of talk about this in terms of kind of conceptualizing this group of infections that collectively cause as much impact in mortality and morbidity in particular. So kind of like the disability adjusted life year impact that you would see in something like the Global Burden of Disease study. These collectively are up there with the big three. But part of the thing was kind of, Hotez would tell this in the context of, we needed kind of like a hook, right? We needed, because the problem was that, you go to the big meetings and you're riding up in the elevator with Bill Gates, and the malaria guys are saying like, look, Bill, like by the time we get to the 20th floor, 13 kids will have died of malaria. And that sounds very kind of transactional and all that stuff, but that's a real issue, right? In terms of like, how do we address these problems and how do they get funded and, and all that. So I don't want to make that sound tawdry, but right. So off of that, right. So how extensive are these things? Well, one of the ways we can look at this is just kind of like geographical distribution, and clearly you take a look at this is a color code from kind of yellow to dark deep red, right? And looking at this is the number of neglected tropical diseases that are endemic in these different countries. And certainly one of the big takeaways here is that there's some areas that have a lot of problems, right? Sub-Saharan Africa is a big issue with lots and lots of neglected tropical disease. The thing I want you to get kind of worldwide is that we're talking about tropical and subtropical zones, and a lot of that is biology, right? A lot of that is those are the environmental conditions under which that can support the eggs and the vectors and the larval stages and so forth to be able to kind of maintain these infections, right? So we can look at distribution. We can also look at the number of cases, and these are a little bit dated, and it's, but the reality is you'd be in the same ballpark with most of these infections if you take a look at the global burden. And the thing I want to kind of point out to you is that neglected tropical diseases infect more than 1 billion of the world's poorest, right? And easily actually, if you total all those up, obviously you get way more than that. So that should suggest to you that there's a lot of co-infection oftentimes, right? So we'll focus actually on just to look at a couple of specifics on soil transmitted helminths, and just these alone get you more than 1 billion infections. And so let's look at just a couple of these, just to drive home a couple of the biological and social components, right? So those 3 infections, ascariasis, trichuriasis, and hookworm, which is actually 2 different human species, those are sometimes called the unholy trinity, right? These are infections that you add those up, and 1.7 billion people are infected, and if you start to take a look at the areas where those occur, you're talking about 3-4 billion people who actually are at risk for infection with these, right? And so, this is just a cool picture of some of the eggs, and from a biology standpoint, if you're interested in this part of it, you ought to kind of take note that at least a couple of these, maybe not hookworm so much, but like things like the giant intestinal worm, ascaris, and whipworm, those eggs are pretty stout, right? They've got some pretty thick walls, and what that ought to suggest is that those eggs probably can survive in the environment for a decent amount of time, and you'd be right. So eggs of ascaris can survive in the environment under the right conditions for months and months and months. And given the fact that you might have a female worm that is cranking out tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of eggs per day, then you can build up a lot of eggs in the environment if they can survive in the environment for a long time. These are not to scale, these pictures. So, I mean, this is from a review paper from a couple of years ago, and you can see this is inside of an intestine, and so this ascaris is what I would tell students is this ascaris is a saddle worm that is big enough to throw a saddle on, right? So compared to hookworm, which you can see there kind of on the side that are kind of reddish, ascaris is for most part living is luminal, right? It's living in the lumen. It's feeding on a lot of the same stuff that you're feeding on. There's a kind of crazy ecological, you're kind of at the same trophic level, right, in the ecosystem in some ways. You can see, really, really big compared to something like hookworm. Like I said, there's a couple of species of hookworm that and obviously can have co-concurrent infections. There's Necator americanus and Ancylostoma duodenale or hookworms, and that's cool. This is the head end. These are a lot smaller worms, but one of the things you should see of this is that on the business end of this worm, you can see some of those have these hooks or spines, right? And what they're doing is those worms are living particularly in the front part of your small intestine where you're absorbing a lot of food, and the way that you do that is by absorbing. You have a huge surface area because a whole bunch of little projections, and what those worms are coming along doing is just like kind of nipping off the end of that and holding on, and they're drinking your blood. and so that's going to come as a result of that lesion. And there's all kind of research done on actually Peter Hotez is involved in a lot of work trying to work on a vaccine. There are no vaccines for these infections, right? So trying to work on a vaccine that actually targets some of the kind of anticoagulant proteins that are being used by those worms, because they use an anticoagulant because they want to keep your blood coursing, right? Because that's what they're feeding on. So despite the fact that they're pretty small, those worms can suck down a decent amount of blood, from 0.01 to 0.1 milliliter of blood per worm per day. And so, if you have a healthy group of those and you're protein malnourished, that's when hookworm causes a lot of problems. And it's largely a sanitation thing. We used to have a huge hookworm problem in the southeastern part of the United States in the early part of the 20th century, but there's a lot of cool history to that. But so where I want to land with this part is just to say, look, there's this common theme, right? And that is what you do with your poop. And so that is a huge theme when you're talking about these kinds of infections and the kind of the social impact, right? And so that's true for hookworm. With hookworm infection, is the issue is you get those eggs in the soil and they're going to hatch out, and there's a juvenile stage that's going to penetrate into your skin, right? So if the conditions are right. And so, you can have, there's some zoonotic infection. There's some dog hookworm that can cause problems even in people. And so this is just a sign from a park near my house in Lafayette, right? Pet waste transmit disease. We know this. Maybe this ought to be a GHI project to have these signs down in Peru and in some of the communities where we work. Amazingly, there's not that many of those signs. I know that's not shocking. And you look, the whole kind of fecal transmission thing is a really important aspect of these other things like whipworm and ascaris as well. So, I just want to say that, like, look, there's lots of studies that kind of demonstrate that relationship, right? And demonstrate the relationship between parasite burden and poor sanitation. I wanted to point out to you some data from a relatively recent paper, and it's really has to do with this association between kind of infection and sanitation. And so if you, I don't know if I can do this, take a look at this, these data here in the center, right? That we're looking at just nicatorants. This is hookworm infection only, and really kind of the main thing to look at here. This is what percentage of the people who had, or the homes that had those infections, had raw sewage in the home. Right, and you can see 89% of the homes, right, had raw sewage in the home, and clearly that, I think we can all agree that that's a problem, right? So so the thing that I really want to draw your attention to is that these, I'm being kind of sneaky, right, because these data, and this goes back to assumptions and perceptions, isn't it? That I think a lot of us would kind of look at that, and we're linking it to these infections of these really, really slum communities in Peru. But the fact of the matter is that these data are from a paper that was looking at human intestinal parasite burden in rural Alabama, right, from just a couple of years ago. If those of you who have read, there's a recent book called Waste, right, by Catherine Flowers, one of the authors on this paper. This is looking at, basically neglected tropical disease in our country, right? And you might be, maybe not, alarmed at the relatively high percentage of homes, for example, in the United States that don't have improved sanitation, don't have improved sewer lines. So again, I guess part of this is to kind of, we can get an idea of global health and neglected tropical disease, but really start to kind of eat around the edges of our kind of way we conceptualize this, right? So this gets, like I said, to assumptions and perspectives, and hey, neglected tropical diseases aren't just for low-income countries anymore, right? So that's a little tongue-in-cheek, but so this was from actually a Hotez paper, a review paper, and you can see, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but you can see that this is looking at areas of really deep poverty, right? 2 standard deviations more than the national average, and where does that poverty exist? And a lot of you, we probably could have figured out, where or predicted where this was going to be. But just for example, like in Appalachia, right? You know, we're talking about infections like ascariasis and strongyloidiasis, right? These are important nematode infections that, again, you know, are quote unquote tropical disease, but actually subsequent analyses by Peter Hotez have shown that, that the really big burdens of quote tropical disease are in fact in some of the G20 countries, but just in really, really poor areas of those countries. So it's not like poor country versus rich country. It's about poor areas anywhere, right? So, so that's a thing. So, all right, so let's keep going. So, you know, I kind of move this along, and I just wanted to point out like a couple of these couple of things that are common to these neglected tropical disease, and I think what we're kind of getting at out of this is that this doesn't necessarily matter if you're talking about, you know, where you're talking about this, right? So, you know, one of the striking things about these is that these are ancient conditions, right? Some of the oldest medical writing, you know, can include descriptions of things that we can identify pretty well of some of these neglected tropical diseases. There are Egyptian mummies that are found that, you know, you do the scans and they've got eggs of schistosomes, you know, down, and they had urinary schistosomiasis, bladder schistosomiasis, for example, right? A lot of these diseases have a high prevalence, right? So you get into communities, and I can take you to a rainforest community in the Amazon in Peru, and 80–90% of the people in that community have those big, long worms, right? These are, as you know, should be getting the picture, are linked to rural poverty. And oftentimes there's a pretty high disease burden. So what that means is there's a lot of people infected, as we pointed out, but there's a relatively low mortality. Right, this is the elevator speech, isn't it? Right, I mean, you're talking maybe 200,000 people a year who die of directly, right, from neglected tropical disease, even though there's lots of like complicating factors. And so that speaks and goes hand in hand with this idea that they're chronic infections. And these are chronic infections, and they cause a lot of disability and disfigurement. And oftentimes that disfigurement, as you can kind of see in some of these photos, right, is very stigmatizing. So if you're a young woman who lives in a culture where you've got to get married, your whole family depends on that, and you've got lymphatic filariasis, and that is not getting you a lot of, you know, marriage offers, that has huge economic consequences for that young woman as well as her family. And so the thing that kind of get on this is like, look, a lot of these diseases are a result. It's a vicious cycle, right? Like, and it cuts both ways. That is to say, they're a result of living in poor conditions, but it's also a cause of poverty. When you look at hookworm disease and the differential impact on women and particularly children of young age, where there are demonstrable cognitive impairments. So kids who have hookworm infection, chronic hookworm infection, have lower IQ. Those kids are not, and not as much energy or whatever, they're not getting jobs, they're not staying in school, therefore not getting good job later on. And it's a perpetual cycle, isn't it, right? So, you know, as we think about kind of the conditions, physical and social, what kind of conditions have to exist if we're going to be, you know, if we're concerned about these kind of infections, you know, hopefully you can think about, we can look at these photos again and say, well, I see the physical evidence, I see the material things, right, of sanitation, I see the water. And that one of the things that kind of I communicate to students is like, what is it that you don't see? And you have to look upstream, right? So you don't see the lack of services, you don't see the municipality and the governmental struggles. And so those are the, you know, a lot of the factors that are super duper important for us to consider. And so this is from this really recent thing that came out, that a review of some of these soil transmitted helminths, and it's just this issue of you know, years lived with disability, missed school, like we were talking about, lack of opportunity, cognitive function, lower grades, health inequities and disparities. You know, many of these things that kind of, this is the big part of the iceberg, right? This common metaphor of poverty, right? So that's ought to kind of ring some bells, right? So like, what's this tell us, and in general, as well as kind of current public health crisis? And so I'm starting to put the landing gear down because this is going to go faster than the other part. I think what this tells us is like understanding social determinants of health is crucial for our global public health, understanding that in our society, right? I mean, I get all jazzed about, you know, infectious disease and wormy kind of infections, but the reality is that the big drivers of health and outcomes, health outcomes, you know, are really non-communicable disease, as was pointed out earlier by Dr. Hatfield, things like obesity and hypertension and so forth, right? Diabetes. These are big problems, and they used to be kind of rich country, wealthy country problems, and now, you know, unfortunately, our low-income countries are starting to catch up, in a sense, with those things. And so what drives that, and what mostly is driving your health, is like these socioeconomic factors, right, of education and job status, you know, your income. And, you know, think about all the stuff that we're doing in our government right now with regard to like, how do we try and address some of these? And there's lots and lots of battles about that, of course, but as well as health behaviors, right, as a big component in terms of tobacco use, diet and exercise, and so forth, right? And access to healthcare and so forth. Notice that, you know, what's not on here is like genetics and stuff like that. It's hard to get away from that, but there's a lot of these social conditions that are driving this. So kind of really draw our attention to this, you know, the social determinants of health, and you know, these in the main circles here in terms of the social and community. And we're suffering right now. A lot of people are suffering with social isolation because of the pandemic and the mental health aspects of that. You know, I would say here where it says Black race, I think is better put racism, right, is the issue, right? To jump down to the bottom, that the whole issue of economic stability and people who have lost their jobs, or who are, you know, the proverbial one paycheck away from a catastrophe, as well as things like the built environment, right? Your neighborhood. The idea that your zip code is a better predictor of your health outcomes than your genetics ought to tell us something with regards to the importance of social determinants of health, right? And that plays into like health and healthcare and access and things like our current health infrastructure. You know, this has gotten, you know, the underbelly, the soft underbelly of our country's lack of good public health infrastructure has really been exposed by the pandemic, hasn't it? Right? I mean, we're just not set up that way. And so the obviously big question is like, is that going to change? And so again, to hinge back to inequities, you know, the importance of inequities for health. And this is really just as COVID as an example, like income matters, right? This is just a figure, you know, showing, you know, the proportion of people, you know, at higher risk because of household income, right? Of serious illnesses with COVID. Race, or more appropriately, racism matters, right? The social conditions that go along with, you know, looking at mortality rates among people of color being much higher than white adults in the country tells us something about the social conditions of the social determinants of health. I mean, these are recent data that came out of the PBS NewsHour, you know, just a couple of days ago or a week ago or so, right? I mean, how the loss of life expectancy in our country, and Black males lost 3 years of life, right, in 6 months. Place matters, right? The whole zip code thing. This is a story that came out a couple of years ago, or some data came out a couple of years ago, looking at causes of mortality in a couple of Baltimore neighborhoods, right? Roland Park and Upton Druid Heights. And you can look at kind of the impact of socioeconomics, right? Median income being quite different. And that's probably not surprising that if you take a look at, like, there's a 20-year life expectancy in these two areas. What is striking is that those communities are about 5 miles apart, right? Now, those kind of inequities exist all over the place. We could go through other examples. And the thing, I guess, to draw your attention to is, again, is that's just like we were talking about in Peru. And so when we go back to full circle to our definition of global health as being kind of transnational issues, we see some of the same kind of issues that we've kind of need to kind of get our arms around. So as we land this, what used to be in the middle here of disease, I could put community health, right, or global health, or public health, to say that it's a quintessential liberal arts problem, isn't it? Right, that many of you and all of you in some ways are participating in. And so to get across to our students that, you know, to do global public health at Wabash or wherever is a way to look at these multidisciplinary problems that have a huge amount of intersection in terms of the issues. Global health issues, challenges, neglected tropical diseases are one component of that, or an interesting model for, or at least a lot of commonalities with our current crisis. And at Wabash, when we, you know, I'm the director of the Global Health Initiative, and you know, whether you know this or not, like, you know, students can now do a minor, an academic minor in global health. And this is some of the stuff that, you know, we talk about. And when I take students to Peru, it's in the context of my global health course. And some of the people in this call have been there with me in different contexts. But and part of the GHI, part of the Global Health Initiative, is to create opportunities to engage in this and to give them really kind of a different set of goggles through which to see the world with empathy. We talk about empathy as our superpower, really, and because we've got to be able to see those different perspectives. And so I'm really interested in getting students who are coming from all aspects of the college, really, because we need those different perspectives. And we need those different opinions and different kind of levels of expertise, right, to be able to tackle these kind of multidisciplinary problems. And again, that's the transformative part, right, to be able to kind of look through these different lenses. And so, you know, I leave them with, like, you know, looking out over that expanse, right, and kind of trying to enlarge their view. And I hope that your view has been enlarged just even a little bit tonight. And like I tell the students, you know, you are that little drop, right? You're that pebble in the pond that we're a small place. But you know, the impact of guys going out of here, you know, you're going to leave. I tell students, you know, you're going to graduate from Wabash as one of the best educated young men in the country at the time. And the big question you have to wrestle with is, so what? And I think that, you know, this kind of perspective and hopefully their transformative education just in general, as well as through global health, kind of helps them answer that question and to really get at the live humanely aspect of our mission. So I'll stop there. Thanks. And we're good with questions or comments or things that, you know, whatever, push back.
Eric, what about water? What about fresh water?
Good thing. Yeah, in terms of, do you want to narrow that? So do you mean in terms of the work that we do?
No, I mean trying to make change through a very simple vector, which is fresh water.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, with the team that I direct, so we have a group of people who are working for the college and making an impact in Peru, like even when we're not there. So I have a team of about 8 Peruvian colleagues who are basically working for us, who work with us, I should say, and who, this is really going to be one of our big themes in Peru for this coming year. Part of the issue, yeah, so the basic question of, like, is water a good place to start? Absolutely, right? Because clean water, a lot of the diseases, a lot of the health issues, at least the infectious disease issues that occur in a lot of these areas are due to, you know, the water is not good, and there's a lot of intestinal diarrheal infections and, you know, and stuff like that, right? So yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, right? Because and I think it's a good one for us to kind of tackle internationally from the standpoint of, or at least be involved in. We're not going to probably solve Peru's water crisis, but it's a good one for us to get involved in, and it's a big problem, right? Because Lima, for example, Lima is in a desert, right? I mean, it's along the Pacific coast. That's all desert. Lima gets maybe an inch or so of rain a year, and so they have a lot of water needs. Lima is a huge city, you know, we're talking 10 million easily, more than that in the greater metropolitan area. And most of their fresh water comes ultimately from glacial melt in the mountains. And so with climate change, Peru's losing their glaciers hand over fist. And
Yeah.
so that's going to be a big problem, not only for Lima, but also for communities in the mountains. Is going to be the same thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it doesn't look good.
Yeah. I mean, there's stuff that you gotta, it's just like, it's like everything, right? It's like, you got to start now. And it's tough, right? Because you're caught, you don't have necessarily the money to be able to do, the desalinization. Lima sits right on the ocean, but that's really expensive. The tech's not there yet, at least for them. Yeah, that's a big thing. There will be water wars, I suspect.
Professor Wetzel,
Sir.
earlier you were talking about how the people in this area in Lima did not own the property on which they live. Have you been in touch with the Institute for Liberty and something down there? It's Hernando de Soto's organization, because that's been his big thing for, gosh, I don't know, 30 years now. And I'm wondering how much impact that has had on getting property rights for these people.
Yeah, we have not gotten into that, but I would love that. Like, those of you who are attorneys or, have that, when I kind of get involved in that legal aspect, like that would be great. We have not done that. I would love to do that, particularly because DeSoto is probably going to be a presidential candidate. And so that'll be interesting because they have elections this year, but we have not done that, but you're exactly right. It is an issue, and it is an issue not just in general. That is to say, it's not just in the kind of an ethereal issue for us. Actually, one of the women in one of the communities where we work in Pamplona Alta, in this really poor area outside of Lima, one of the things that we've kind of outgrown of a little community kitchen building that has been there that we've used as kind of a base of operations in a lot of ways, and we're kind of changing that, but kind of outgrown that. And part of the issue is like, can we kind of look? I would love it if some of you would kind of, this is an open invitation. I'm just like going on offense here. If I've proposed to the college that this is kind of a pipe dream, but I've proposed to the college, like, let's build a center of global community health development in concert with people who live in the community there. But to get the land and the property to do that, that's a tricky thing, right? Because this woman has this, built this whole community center or whole community kitchen, and it's not clear who owns the land there. Yeah, that is a gnarly problem, but it would be great to hook up with them. That's a great suggestion. I appreciate that. Taylor Kenyon, I saw that you had your hand up, which is amazing. I saw that, but
appreciate it. It's a great talk, Dr. Wetzel. So I was curious because you've actually had boots on the ground serving the Peruvian community, and as a few of you know, I've had a lot of interest in global health engagement. So what would you, in your opinion, view as the future skills for global health workers?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question from the standpoint of, I think there's a skill set. I'm not sure that all of that skill set is going to be acquired here, right? Like, so, I said that we have a global health minor, and, to be honest, like when I first started doing this, it's been 10 years, basically the first time that I taught a global health course, 10 years to this spring, that I taught global health. And, back in the day, I was quite zealous about like, man, we ought to get a minor, and that's going to be like baby step to getting a major. And, and global public health programs at colleges and universities, when they take root, they grow fast. Right. So, next year we'll have 10 minors, graduate with a minor in global health, and it's just a couple of years old. So how do we staff it? How do we, especially in pandemic times, tough. But I think that I'm convinced now that, that I'm not pushing hard for a major in global health at Wabash, because I think that a Wabash education is one of the best preparations for work, for students to leave as an undergraduate for work in public health. because it's a liberal arts, quintessential liberal arts, multidisciplinary issue, and you've got to be able to synthesize and put stuff together. I think that a solid Wabash education with a good minor in global health is great, preparation for students to go into other areas. I think that the one part where we could try and tweak and get better, not just one part, there's lots of parts, but one of the big areas where we could tweak and get better at is kind of on the quantitative side. And as part of the minor, we have an epidemiology course, but that we've started, but that's a little bit like patchworky still, and looked at a lot of that as staffing and stuff like that, right? But more of like more statistical analysis, more kind of big data analysis, things that you're involved in and doing as part of your projects with the Indiana Rural Health Association, right? So I think that's a big component of it. So I should point out too that our work in global health and the Global Health Initiative, I can sometimes, because I talk a lot about it, and particularly when I'm doing a talk like this and it's about neglected tropical disease, it's easy to talk about the international side. But I do want to say that we do a huge amount of internships, summer internships. The absolute lion's share of our internships and our work throughout the most of the year is local or state, right? And so we'll have this coming summer, even last summer during the pandemic, we made the strong argument of, hey, look, we're about public health and global health, like we need to be in the fight. And so while a lot of internships got canceled, we were able to adapt a lot of our internships or make sure that students were safe and stuff like that and still work. And so we had students working, I think, in like 4 or 5 different county health departments in the state of Indiana. And we work with, we send interns to Taylor, at the Indiana Rural Health Association, and with a food pantry, Crooked Creek Food Pantry through Steve Clappy, who's an alumnus, and have students work on kind of bigger questions of food insecurity and students who work, at the health department and so forth. So there's a lot of things that we do kind of on that whole local to global, local to international continuum. So we're looking for solid, sustainable community partners to be able to do that. So
let me jump in here. I have 8:03. I don't want this to kind of peter out and end without giving a proper thank you to Dr. Wetzel. Your passion, every time I hear you, Eric, shows through. Great job tonight, and I know we all appreciate that. If anyone wants to, hang on and talk a little bit more with Eric, I think that would be fine. But I do want to properly end it here, and thank you all for joining. Keep an eye up for other events. The next one we have is March 23rd. We're doing our virtual alumni awards ceremony. These are the awards that we typically give the morning of homecoming at the Hollett Alumni Chapel. So keep an eye out for those, and we'd love to have you on that. That's Tuesday night, March 23rd. So thank you for joining, everybody.
Thanks, Dr. Wetzel.
Yeah, you bet. I'm cool with staying on and chatting, and if people have other questions or whatever, like I can hang out for a little while. So I don't want to keep Steve up all night, but
thanks, Eric.
I'm co-host, so Steve,
He's used to staying up all night, Eric.
Say what?
That Hoffman's used to staying up all night, so don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's it.
Because I didn't start till
Thank you, Eric.
11:30.
Great presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I was wondering if the fact that your students have now actually lived through a pandemic, maybe the interest in Global Health Initiative will increase. I mean, a pandemic to them now isn't something that happens somewhere else.
Yeah.
They've lived through it. I wonder if that'll spur their interest.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope it doesn't have the opposite effect, right? It's certainly easy to make the argument, isn't it? That we need to kind of pay attention and get involved. I will say that we have a really large number of students who are involved, early in this whole thing. Even the planning of this started in back in the spring, and in a lot of ways grew out of conversations that in the Global Health Initiative that we were having with regards to how do we create opportunities for students to effectively work as kind of like mini community health workers, right? And how do we get students involved in our local community and in things that are appropriate for their expertise or lack thereof, and and things like that, right? And really kind of like wanted to get students to in a touch with the community so that they actually see the stuff that's going on, and that kind of quickly said, well, what if we kind of give those same skills, and maybe it's to Taylor's question, right? Like that same skill set, but we need to turn that inward because it's all hands on deck. And so you may have seen this on the website or whatever, but what got created out of that, and this is really driven by the Healthy Campus Task Force on campus, but grew out of those early GHI conversations, was something that's called the COVID Action Response Team, or Response and Education Team, right? So the CARE team. And so we created a whole structure, and we hired students to be part of a team where every student on the campus has a team leader. They're on a group of students that's largely driven by housing unit, right? So where they live, kind of go by zip code in some sense. And so we created a system of leaders, care team leaders, and every one of those leaders is responsible for roughly 15 students on campus. And then there's another tier of care team managers who are as a group of 4 or 5 students who really their job is to kind of help look out over the leaders and kind of keep them on task and keep them. And then those managers report to Jill Rogers, actually kind of got involved as the coordinator of that whole structure. And so, so we have probably 40 some students. We have 5% of the student body basically is on this care team and in a lot of ways they're doing local community public health. They're getting an amazing training amount of experience, whether they know it or not. But it's not easy. So it's been tough for them. It's oftentimes it's feast or famine sometimes on the work, and they have a lot of responsibility, but it's good experience. I hope our conversations now really are at the kind of the planning level are, so post-COVID, how do we, because I feel in terms of interest in global health, in terms of what we've seen, what the students are capable of doing in all of this and what they're learning, like we have moved to a slightly higher position. We've moved uphill here, and my thing is like, let's not retreat, right? Like we don't want to go back down the hill. Like we've gotten to a higher point of ground, so we can see a little bit higher. We can see more now, and so how do we leverage that experience? And we're not kind of looking for another infectious disease to spring up. Let's not. But how do we take that and translate that experience into other opportunities for the students? And maybe that has to do with mental health. Maybe it has to do with men's health. It may be that we stay kind of inwardly focused on those kind of things. There's plenty of health issues to think about. But I think it's important to look that way, as well as how can we be involved in the community as well. So, Dr. Hatfield.
Just a comment. We are now, I've been involved giving vaccinations here in the Phoenix area, and we're just trying to move into other poor communities. But the public health departments of the United States, for beg, borrow, or steal, were in fact pretty much completely neglected by the previous administration as far as to sort of develop the capacity to develop vaccinations quickly and get them available within a remarkable period of time. But very little was done to actually frame up, either at the state level or at the public health level within those states, very much of a system that would help. And, you know, I would suggest to you that we've just, in our Great Decisions course, I've just given a couple of lectures to several of these things, because we need to watch what the WHO actually is able to cobble together, because they are completely underfunded in there. The total budget of the WHO is about $8 billion a year. And that is just about the size of many of our metropolitan healthcare systems. These are multi-billion dollar things, even in our cities. So, and there's no small price to pay in that Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, and of course Johnson & Johnson. Pfizer is one of, if not the largest pharmaceutical company in the world, and they are going to be supplying and registering. Again, that the vaccines are not really registered yet. I mean, they're not fully approved by the FDA. And when you get an FDA approval, then you get 12 years of exclusivity within the United States to market whatever is done, and so forth. There's many nuances to this, and I think that we will see the COVID vaccinations and Sputnik 5 and all of the other ones that China is purporting, and Russia and so forth. These will get globally distributed, but you wouldn't have to go very far in public health, because this stuff will all be to involve students with understanding how that happens, because it's an immediate history being written, and you can almost follow the blog. You don't really have to go to Mumbai or anywhere to actually experience that. This is easily obtained just by a little bit of groundwork. So I just make that suggestion. COVID is nobody in public health has ever done this in more than a century. The Chinese trying to isolate 10 million people so it won't escape Wuhan. Nobody's ever tried this. We've never tried to vaccinate 250 million people for anything. So, I mean, history is being rewritten right here as far as studying who gets it, how fast they get it. The disparities are growing and can be studied and make case history for how to do improvements.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I appreciate your words and that perspective. I mean, it's just absolutely right. There's no you don't have to venture far, right, to do global health, right? So, yeah.
Well, I really appreciate the effort. I think it's a wonderful thing. Just to comment, the slums in Mumbai, of Slumdog Millionaire, the movie, and all that other stuff. All those things are just created by the poor people coming in from the more primitive areas and so forth. And literally that is city land that just hasn't been developed yet. And they go into these areas, and the slum develops, and all of the microeconomy of the slums and so forth occurs, and then it becomes darn hard to move the people out. But if they decide they want a giant corporate center there, then they will move those people, but it becomes a big local fight as to where. The slums just develop anywhere they can find a crack, and that's why nobody has real ownership who wants to go in there and fix things, because it's all local.
Yeah, for sure. And there's some of that Yeah, I mean, it's complicated.
Very complicated.
There for sure,
Right.
there's some common history with some of the areas where we work in Peru. You know, there's reasons that people come there, of course, and you know, a lot of those areas where we in Lima, anyways, a lot of those areas are a result of people fleeing. You know, it's displaced people, right? Internally displaced people and people who are fleeing shining path terrorism in the late 80s and early 90s and from the mountains particularly. But so it's interesting just in terms of that is one of the great problems and one of the big issues in terms of global health, right? It has to do with kind of the movements of people, particularly as a result of armed conflict and stuff like that. Those are two big areas. So there's some interesting commonalities and kind of lots of levels of resolution on those things. So yeah.
In less than a minute, I'll also just throw out one other little gem as an oncologist and so forth. One of the most common cancers in the world is untreated cervical cancer in women because they don't do any pap tests. And now with the HPV vaccines, they may be able to stem the tide with the vaccines. But the pharmaceutical companies, of which I was participatory for nearly as long as I practiced oncology, the net present value, that's what we talk about. In other words, if I developed a drug for something, what would be the value to the company I work for or the globe, even with a global market? The net present value for developing a treatment for advanced cervical cancer and all of the things that would go into that development is a negative value. Because all of this occurs in countries and populations that you develop the cure and that it would have to be free type of thing in order to ever get it down the line. This is true of many things like this, and hard realities come in investing things. We can do medical miracles, but they all come with a need to develop a business. And actually, the pharmaceutical companies are the only ones that can take academic targets as identified in our universities and so forth, and actually then throw the drugability and the crystallography and all of the other advanced techniques that let you get down the road toward a drug. I think that's all the time I needed, 60 seconds to say that, but thank you very, very much. It's a wonderful thing you're doing and broadening the eyes of all Wabash men.
Oh, thank you. Glad you could be here.
Dr. Wetzel.
Yeah.
Real quickly, because I don't want to keep you up all night. Is there any area where you can pull up the GHI curriculum or maybe a flyer or something? I think I know the general page, but I probably should be more knowledgeable about that, making me feel old.
This would be the ongoing battle, wouldn't it? Yeah, I can shoot you that info. You know, how about that? Like,
just in general,
I won't search it for it right now.
Appreciate it.
If you go to like the academic stuff and look for majors and minors, maybe this is what you're talking about. And I mean, you can get to kind of like the curriculum. Is that what you just said, right? You can
yeah.
Part of it. Yeah, there is a page that if you search for Wabash X initiatives, right? You should be able to somewhere find a page that has I can try and look for it real quick. Hold on.
I appreciate it, since I have a captive audience.
Right. Yeah. So if you go to that link I just put in the chat, then that goes to kind of the initiatives, right? And inside of that, you'll be able to see a global health. There's a global health link.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Sure. Good to see everybody else.
Dr. Wetzel, I
Hey, how's
often
it going?
see, so I edit medical research papers that come out of Pakistan and India all the time. And I see a decent proportion of these where the conclusion, the paper kind of says this research is for policymakers to consider. So there's appeals to local government folks to reform. Like I'll see papers on updating the traffic laws because there's so many motorcycle accidents and incidents.
Yeah.
Local like hygiene initiatives or like awareness of certain medical conditions, especially in even communities within those cultures that are more less privileged, even like women's health.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a push from the academic world within those areas, if they have them, to sort of get the word out. And I've seen it just through the manuscripts I've edited. I wonder if there's sort of a way to connect with those groups and amplify those voices. That's just
Yeah, you mean amplify the voices of kind of like the like addressing the policy part of it?
Well, yeah, or like there's a subset of researchers in these countries that are aware of these issues, and they're sort of in their work, ringing the alarm bell through submissions to academic journals. I wonder if there's some side of this that there can be more of an awareness campaign from those researchers and those authors who, a lot of them are working to get published to get tenure or whatever they need to do for that.
Yeah. So yeah, you mean just in terms of like kind of spreading the good word? Yeah. No, I think that it's a right. It's a slow thing, and I swear.